So welcome everybody to our Socialist Labour Network meeting, Ukraine, Truth and Lies. The prevalent war propaganda from all positions in the war in Ukraine makes it very difficult to have even an inkling as to the truth is what is actually happening in Ukraine. Certainly the war didn't begin from a standing start in February 2022. Understanding is key, and we hope this evening to discover some of the truth and lies. We have speakers who studied the situation in Ukraine and who will bring their perspectives on the propaganda we see all around us. We'll listen then to each of our speakers, who will each speak for around 10 minutes, if they wish to, and then we will take contributions from the floor. I know that at least 2 attendees have recently met with Alex Wilson, and we might hear from them. We also hope to hear from the journalist Vanessa Beeley if she's been able to get to the meeting. Firstly, however, we note the extradition of Julian Assange authorised by the British courts this week. And the steering committee would like to make the following statement, and we'll post it in the chat so that you can see it. As we meet to interrogate truth and lies in media reports of war, we affirm that Socialist Labour Network stands in solidarity with Julian Assange. We condemn the extradition process being conducted by the UK and USA. Julian Assange is a journalist who revealed matters of grave importance about US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Journalists have a duty to hold the powerful to account and to uncover wrongdoing by governments and inform the people. Journalists have a duty to seek for the truth. If Julian is extradited to the USA, every journalist of any nationality residing in any country could be vulnerable to the same process. This is demonstrably wrong. We resolve to continue to campaign for the immediate release of Julian Assange. So that's our statement. And in the context of this evening, we note the West's hypocrisy over Russian war crimes in Ukraine compared to the prosecution of Assange for revealing US war crimes. We possibly will come back to that topic later on. The all members meeting of the Socialist Labour Network has already published a statement about Ukraine, which was agreed at its all members meeting, and we'll post the statement in the chat so that people can see it. It's also on our website. I won't read all of that out loud now because it's quite long. It was modelled on the FBU motion and then we made it even longer. So we'll move now to our speakers and welcome all of them to our meeting this evening. David has indicated that he needs to get away in good time, so I'm going to invite David to speak first. Most of you will already know David. He's one of the world's leading academic experts on Islamophobia and also specialises in the analysis of state and corporate lobbying. He's tracked corporate power for 15 years. He set out the UK's lobbying watchdog, Spinwatch, and their work is including investigations on the pharmaceutical lobby, the fossil fuel and fracking lobbies, as well as state lobbies, such as those of Israel and the United Arab Emirates. I've also seen, David, you've spoken quite recently and quite often on Ukraine, which is why I've invited you to speak here this evening. So thank you very much, David, and over to you.
Thank you, Esther. So I'm going to make a few comments, but I suppose I start with endorsing what you said earlier about the overwhelming propaganda on this conflict. And I suppose I'm maybe not surprised, but disappointed that so many people on the left appear to have, I don't know, drunk the Kool-Aid on the evil Russians in a way which I think is pretty extraordinary. Now, I suppose that we can talk about why that is, and maybe if I make a couple of comments about that first of all before we go on to talk about how to understand Ukraine. I suppose that, you know, that the history of the attempts to demonize the Russian state has been quite well discussed in the public sphere. I mean, in the sense that we've had a number of different propaganda campaigns trying to convince us that the Russians are a threat, Putin in particular, but the Russians more generally are a threat to the West, to the UK. And the two things I would talk about in relation to that are, on the one hand, Russiagate, the idea that Putin, and you see this, people on the left posting this photograph of Marine Le Pen with Putin, say, oh, this is something that Marine Le Pen doesn't want to be shown around the web. Well, you know, and the other part of the argument is, well, you know, that the Russians got their troll factories from the Internet Research Agency to support Brexit. And the reason we've got Brexit is not because people were pissed off with the European Union or with elite politics, but because of the Russian troll factories, and they supported UKIP and Farage and this bunch of tricksters. And they say the same about Russia, about the US. Trump was all to do with, or, you know, to some extent to do with the troll farms and the Russians, etc. Now, you know, if you've read anything about this, then you know that this is entirely wrong. I mean, not just a little bit wrong, exaggerated, some misinformation in there, entirely wrong. There is nothing to suggest that any of that stuff happened. When you look at the actual evidence for Russiagate, you find that the alleged troll factories and troll accounts and bots, which were supposed to be involved in getting Trump elected, mostly tweeted after the election had happened, mostly didn't talk about Trump, we're talking about other things. And of course, you know, in the end, the big story about Russiagate is that the Internet Research Agency is a commercial firm in St. Petersburg. It's nothing to do with the Putin regime. I mean, it's a completely crazy conspiracy theory, which of course has been concocted, not least by gullible and committed journalists and their friends in the secret state. This is no surprise. We knew this back when the Skripal thing happened, back when the scandal of the Integrity Initiative happened. But people want to forget that, and they want to say, oh, well, yes, the Russians, they are bad and they try and influence our politics, and probably that's what's going on just now. And, you know, if there's something which the West says is not true, and other people say it is true, well, then of course that must be lines from the Putin playbook or Russian propaganda or some such nonsense like that. That's how people respond to it. And people on the left, very sadly, but people on the left are responding to it in that kind of way. Let me say one word about the Integrity Initiative. So the Integrity Initiative, as people will probably recall, we did a briefing paper on it on the Syria Propaganda and Media website, was a £3 million project funded by the Foreign Office through its intelligence-connected budget on Russian disinformation. And it was an organization called the Institute for Statecraft, which has an office in central London, a rather swanky office in central London, albeit in the basement of a swanky building, but which was headquartered at that stage, not anymore, was headquartered in a derelict mill in Fife in Scotland, which several people went to, including, I remember Chris Williamson went up to have a little look at it. And this was effectively an MI6 project run by someone who was at that time a serving officer from MI6, who was put in there to oversee the rest of the team, who were led by an honorary colonel in military intelligence. You know, this guy called Chris Donnelly, rather embarrassing Cold Warrior. So this was a project intended to counter Russian disinformation, and it tried to do that. But of course, also it became controversial because quite a lot of its activities on Twitter were attacking, big surprise, Jeremy Corbyn and the Corbyn-led Labour Party as part of this idea that they were somehow communists or Russian agents or something like that. And of course, the government denied that they had anything to do with the Twitter account of the Institute for Statecraft until, of course, the documents which had been leaked, which resulted in the story emerging in the first place, were produced, which showed that actually the Foreign Office was paying for the Twitter account. So the Foreign Office was actually, MI6 was actually paying this military intelligence outfit to undermine the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, which is, of course, is completely not allowed in democracy according to the archaic rules of our so-called democracy. So that's kind of some of the backstory of how we got to hating Putin so much. But of course, the big thing people say is, well, he started this war, he invaded. I mean, you can't say that this is to do with NATO expansion. He shouldn't have invaded. And of course, you can make that argument. But let's remember, this goes back. I mean, people know this, right? I don't want to belabor the point in this, but let me say make 2 points about this. This goes back to 2014 when there was a coup, a US-backed, Western-backed coup in Ukraine, in which the far right played a key role, including in the Maidan Massacre. Now, it's well known now, if you've paid any attention, and people on the left should pay attention, that the massacre was carried out by Nazis and their supporters, including mercenaries from Georgia. Now, this is perfectly clear from all the evidence that's come out in the trials. The trials trying to pin the massacre on the government, which was deposed in the coup. But if you look at, for example, let me just direct people to this. Ivan Kachanovsky's work, who's an academic from the University of Ottawa, just look his work up on the Maidan Massacre. And it's absolutely clear what happened there. There's just a massacre committed by the right, including killing their own supporters and demonstrators in order to remove the democratically elected president of Ukraine, which they did. And of course, that led to the outrage in eastern Ukraine and Donbass, and to what happened in Donbass was the creation of these new republics, breakaway republics, largely by defections from the Ukrainian military. I mean, the Donbass military in Lugansk and in Donetsk largely was formed from people defecting and deserting from the Ukraine military and forming a new military faction. It wasn't formed by Putin supplying them with weapons. Apparently, there's no evidence at all of Russian supply weapons there. So that's what we see there. And of course, the immediate precursor to the alleged start of the war, which is the Russian invasion, as it's called, was the fact that the Ukrainians were shelling again Donetsk. People know the figures about the thousands and thousands of deaths since 2014. Started to shell Lugansk and Donetsk, and that was the beginning of the war. The response to that, let's put it like that, was the Russian involvement, because essentially what was happening here was a military aggression against part of groups of people who were officially part of the Ukraine. So let me go on to say something else now, just before I start to talk about the question of lies. So when people say we stand with Ukraine, well, my first question is, well, who do you mean? Which Ukrainians are you standing with? Are you standing with the Nazis in the Azov battalion or regiment, or the right sector, or C-14, or any of the other Banderist fascist collaborators? Are you standing with the ordinary people of Ukraine? If you're standing with the ordinary people of Ukraine, do you mean the ones in Kharkov, in Mariupol, in Odessa, in Lugansk and Donetsk? Do you mean those people? Because they don't support the Nazis. They don't want the Nazis to be running their towns. And so, of course, the difficulty in having this kind of self-determination position, which many on the left have, is that it's not clear what the Ukraine actually is in that context, because there's a dispute about it. And that's a really very important point in terms of theoretically understanding what's going on there. So let me go on to, I don't know how long I've got, but I'm going to talk about lies now. So from the beginning, and we should have paid more attention to this when it happened, shouldn't we? I mean, I feel guilty for that myself, not paying enough attention. When Snake Island happened, remember what happened there when the Ukrainian government, when Zelensky said, oh, look, the Russians have been bad, and they've killed all these people, and here, there's posthumous medals for them. And of course, the people turned up, the Ukrainians turned up in Moscow saying, we're not dead. we were taken prisoner by the Russians. And that was a very early sign that the Ukrainians were going to lie all the way through this conflict. And so far, it's proved to be the case. And maybe some of what I'm going to say now is controversial, but it's pretty clear from the evidence that it's the case. So let me start with not with the first one chronologically, but with the second one chronologically, which is an example which is not disputed by anyone that I've seen, which is the bombing of the mosque in Mariupol, Turkish mosque, an attempt, it would seem, to bring the Turkish government in on Zelensky's side. And that was punctured almost immediately by the statement from the imam, who was in the mosque at the time, saying that there hasn't been a bombing of the mosque. There is no bombing of the mosque. And you could see from the video footage that you saw at the time that it hadn't been bombed. And that statement was then also endorsed by the Turkish foreign minister. I noticed recently, I haven't seen this verified, but I noticed recently that the Russians have claimed that they liberated the mosque by killing 29 Nazis, and they've released the hostages who were taken. And that's another part of the story, isn't it? That on one account of this is that the Azov and their mates have been routinely holding civilians hostage. And we see it even in Azovstal now, where the most recent attempts of the Azov Brigade battalion people to get out has been to say, well, we have all these civilians here and the Russians won't let them out. Well, I mean, anyone who pays any attention, and that means people who are not watching the Western media, obviously, knows that the Russians have on very many occasions now tried to set up humanitarian corridors using white and red flags, etc., and not a single person has come out along those. Either that's because everyone's very scared because the Russians are bad and they're going to kill them, or it's because the Azov battalion, brigade, regiment, whoever they are stopping civilians from getting out. And that is the story which we hear time and time again in Mariupol and Kharkov and other places too, that there are human shields being taken. Of course, the Azov put themselves in the 4th and 5th floor of a block of flats. They confine the residents to the basement. Sometimes they steal the basement from them too, and they do that to attract fire. I mean, this has been repeatedly said by huge numbers of witnesses who now have come out of Mariupol and said those things. So lies all the way through. So I mentioned the mosque. Let's go back to the before the mosque, which is the famous incident of the Mariupol and maternity hospital number 3. Now, if people have looked at this, they know that there are a variety of hospitals in that area. When we saw the footage of these people coming out of the hospital, that's 3 hospitals in a horseshoe shape in Western Mariupol. Now the Russians said these are fake, and that this woman, who is a beauty blogger, has been dressing up in different clothes and has 3 different sets of clothes and is different and is trying to present herself as being different people. Now that turns out to have been false. There wasn't one woman pretending to be 3 women. It was her with the same clothes, but by carrying a blanket and 2 shots, and it was a different woman in the thing. So what the Russians said was false, right? But nevertheless, the big picture of that event, and what the Russians said was correct about that, was that the Azov had taken over the hospital. The people were in the basement, and what happened, whether we don't know who shelled it. Probably there was a Russian shell. We don't know, but it wasn't a hit on the hospital. And the people then left and they were photographed. So that was a fake to some extent. The same was true, I think, of the theatre, again, which we saw very, very little evidence of any actual casualties there or any rescue operation. There was one video which has been released, which has been pretty comprehensively debunked by Lobster magazine just the other day. And the same is said can be said for the art school, and that's several false flag operations we can point to. I've got a child trying to get in. So let me finish off by saying very briefly. Let me get her. Right, you can't speak. Come on then. Oh, you have to wait. Okay, sorry. Just very briefly then. Bucha and Kramatorsk. Now, Bucha has been well debunked by people who've looked at it. It's pretty well known that as I've went in there, that they committed atrocities. And there's footage of them arranging the bodies by dragging them with ropes on the streets of Bucha. So again, a false flag. And the last one, Kramatorsk, the Kramatorsk missile is a kind of missile which the Russians don't use anymore, where the serial number is of Ukrainian origin and whether in the direction of the travel of the missile is that it came from the southwest, which was in Ukrainian control. So all of these have been attempts by, let me not forget the chemical weapons, the alleged chemical weapons, which even the Pentagon and British intelligence have said probably didn't happen. So again, another false flag there. So I'm going to have to finish now. But so my point is that there have been many false flags in this whole process, and you know, we would do well not to pay any attention to the crap which there is on Western media, and to try and find our own sources and to look and examine properly the various sources that are available, and many are available, especially on Telegram, to undermine, criticize, and try to get to a more objective account. Not everything we can't know everything at present because we're in a fog of war situation, but it's pretty clear so far that the big lies that have been revealed have all been on the Ukrainian side. That's me.
Thank you very much, David. It would be useful to start to compile some of those sources. It is necessary to read very widely in order to get at least a hint of the truth. And yes, who are the Ukrainians? Really good question. I hope that we'll hear a little bit more about that from Yurii in particular. And as well as who are the Ukrainians, what is the truth? And I hope that we will be able to get some further insights onto that this evening. Tony's posted a link to one of the massacres that's in the chat, so the Maidan Massacre. So I've also suggested that people watch the Oliver Stone film Ukraine on Fire. So thank you very much, David. We're sorry you're not able to stay for questions, but really appreciate that you were able to come along this evening. Thank you very much. And we're going to move
very much.
Thank you, to Chris. Chris Williamson. So you'll all know Chris as a former Labour MP and founder of the Resist movement and the Left Legal Fighting Fund. Chris has also spoken and studied, researched on Ukraine. So Chris, we're really looking forward to hear what you have to say on this topic this evening.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that introduction, Esther. And I don't know about anybody else, any of the other panelists or any of the people who are watching, but personally speaking, I'm absolutely sick to death of the gung-ho liberals and the pseudo-socialists who, as far as I'm concerned, are essentially promoting an Orwellian propaganda. I mean, we've heard from David now about the number of false flags that are being put out there, and people are taking this as gospel, and the Western media is an absolute travesty of the truth. But what really troubles me is the number of people who claim to be on the left, people in the Labour movement, who are absolutely gunning for war, it seems to me. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, people may have seen, it was posted on social media, a march which I believe was organised by the Labour movement, people within the Labour movement, sponsored by various trade unions. Certainly there were prominent banners there of various trade unions like the PCS, the National Union of Mine Workers, Unison, Unite. The gathering was led by and addressed by Paul Mason and Peter Tatchell. Paul Mason made a grotesque remark when he said he was looking forward to seeing Putin hanging from a meat hook. I mean, what on earth is going on here? I mean, they were marching down the streets. I've seen the footage of it, chanting, put an end to Putin's reign, arm Ukraine. And there is a Labour candidate in Derby. I won't embarrass him by mentioning his name, although he may be proud of this, but he's actually equating socialism, believe it or not, with NATO. He's saying that, NATO is socialism in action. These people have lost their minds. I mean, it's incredible that we see so many people claiming to be on the left who are absolutely indulging in warmongering over this last sort of few months. I mean, I just wonder how many people have to die, how many Ukrainians have to die before the inevitable outcome and that inevitable outcome, as far as I'm concerned, will be that Ukraine will be a neutral country. NATO will have to pull back and end its expansionary ambitions, because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is World War III and potential nuclear holocaust. And I just wonder what is driving this sort of response that we're seeing, you know, in the media by the political class, but as I say, most disappointingly by people who claim to be members of the, and indeed are, part of the Labour movement. I mean, it's real Russophobia, it's real racism, it's real kind of hatred of Russians, it seems to me. And I just wonder, where is the anti-war movement? I mean, we really do need them to step up to the plate. I think Stop the War's vacillation is pathetic, frankly. I mean, they're kind of trying to draw some sort of equivalence between Russia and NATO. There is no equivalence as far as I am concerned. NATO is an expansionary, aggressive military alliance, and the history kind of speaks for itself. People only need to look at that to see that that is a fact. And you know, we don't have to agree with Russia's internal policy or indeed even its foreign policy, but the adventures which it has engaged in have been around its borders. It hasn't been indulging in sort of global imperialist adventures in the way in which the United States, the way in which NATO has. And I just think we absolutely have to wake up, because otherwise we're heading for World War III. All the focus from the political class right across the chamber of the House of Commons is about escalation, all this talk about increasing lethal aid. We've heard about the Pentagon, I think it was a week or two ago, meeting with 8 weapons contractors because they're looking forward to a protracted war in Ukraine. We've got the media and senior politicians, people like Tobias Ellwood, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, actually talking about a UK-led naval operation, believe it or not, to prevent the Russians from taking Odessa. I mean, that's World War III. This is what they're advocating, and you've got, you know, senior senators in the state, senior politicians over here, you know, actively talking about directly confronting Russia, you know, putting troops on the ground. And I just say, you know, what for? What is this all about? I mean, are we seriously talking about risking World War III for Volodymyr Zelensky? Seriously? Are we talking about risking World War III for the neo-Nazi Azov battalion or the right sector that David spoke about? Are we seriously risking World War III to swell the coffers of the military-industrial complex? We know that the share prices of arms companies, military companies are on the increase, you know, and I think was it the Raytheon CEO was talking about great opportunity that the company now can take advantage of from this war. But the real reason for the war, well, let's be clear, it's a proxy war, isn't it? It's a proxy war of NATO against Russia, and it's a fossil fuel. It's yet another fossil fuel war, and what the aim is, of course, is to weaken and ultimately crush Russia in order to balkanize it, so that the West, the so-called West, the neocons responsible for policy in NATO and the US and here for that matter, can pivot against China. We've already seen kind of, you know, military operations going on in the South China Seas, which Britain has participated in, and so clearly the aim is to keep this war going as long as possible. I mean, they're talking about you know, defeating the Russians. I don't think that's frankly possible to do. The Russians cannot be beaten. Ukraine cannot win this war, no matter how many arms are sent by the West. The only way that this can go in the opposite direction would be if indeed we do end up in World War III, and you know, the potentiality of a nuclear holocaust. So we're seeing the political class, seeing the media actually, you know, calling for you know, prolonging the war through this lethal aid, the use of sanctions, but none of it's working. Russia are making steady progress in the war. If you actually, you know, look at alternative sources of information other than the nonsense that we see in the Western media, and the sanctions are clearly not having the effect that the West hoped that it would do, kicking Russia out of SWIFT and so on, is actually all backfiring against the West, backfiring against Russia, backfiring against the United Kingdom. I mean, Russia has now solidified its links with China. It's building ties with India, with Pakistan, with the non-allied countries around the world. And this is all blowing back predominantly against Europe, but there is a potential blowback for the United States as well, and the dominance of the petrodollar. Indeed, the potentiality of the US dollar losing its reserve currency status is now a very real prospect, actually. I mean, we've heard about the Russians talking about selling gas in rubles in future, and all the efforts to destabilize the economy, to destroy the Russian economy, it's just not working. In fact, the last round of sanctions that were imposed saw, in the immediate aftermath of that, the ruble rallied, and the Russian stock market rose as well. But it's actually hurting us. We're seeing energy prices, as we've seen, going through the roof. We're looking at the potentiality of substantially greater increases in the future in terms of energy prices, but also food prices as well, because at the end of the day, we're talking about the bread baskets of the world there, and also not just kind of food exports and the fact that this war is going to have an impact in terms of food prices, but also all the other commodities that come out of Russia. And fertilizers, we've heard about the National Union of Farmers, very, very concerned about the inability to obtain fertilizer. So, as I say, this potential food shortage, which we may be faced with. So, this cost of living crisis that people keep talking about is turning into a cost of living catastrophe for millions of people as a direct consequence of this war in Ukraine. But none of the political class, none of the media is talking about it. And we really do, it seems to me, need to raise our voices. We need to expose what the real agenda is here and demand that the priority should be switched from endless war to perpetual peace, because, as we already said, Esther, the alternative really doesn't bear thinking about. We are talking a very real prospect of World War III and the potential annihilation of civilization.
Thank you very much, Chris. Terrifying scenarios painted there, and we can see with inflation ratcheting in the West, the implications on gas, oil, food, many other commodities, and Ukraine certain car parts. It is devastating for people everywhere, and Russia and China in the US sites is a clear objective in my view. On your point on peace, and I've seen many comments and discussions in the chat on peace, I'm really pleased to welcome our next speaker, who is from Ukraine, Yurii Sheliazhenko. I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly, Yurii. Yuri's a peace activist in Ukraine. He's secretary of the Ukrainian pacifist movement. He's a board member of the European Bureau for Conscientious Objection, that's based in Brussels, and of World Beyond War, based in the US. He's a lecturer and a research assistant at Kiev University. So, Yurii, welcome. If you'd like to unmute yourself, and if you'd like to speak to us now, please.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about non-violent approach to crisis around Ukraine. I know that the global left was split on the issue whether Russia is imperialist aggressor like Nazi Reich trying to conquer innocent Ukraine, or on the contrary, Russia is innocent victim of Western aggression and imperialism embodied in Nazi Ukraine. I can't agree with both extremities. I will argue that both sides in this split are not understanding the situation correctly, because both sides share archaic culture of violence and war. while the future belongs to progressive culture of peace and non-violence. And future of the left depends on ability to act not on the basis of fear to lose so-called class war, but on the basis of hope to turn all people into peaceful and happy workers on the planet without armies and borders, without imperialism, without class struggle and other forms of oppression. If you doubt this hope is realistic, I should say another thing. We should admit we have insufficient practical knowledge about nonviolent way of life because we don't invest enough into peace culture. And because of that, our research and education in the field of peace and nonviolence is very superficial and subordinated to violent thinking, unfortunately. This problem is more vivid in post-Soviet countries like Ukraine and Russia, where instead of civics in schools, we have military patriotic education. And the state openly tries to make people rather obedient soldiers than creative citizens. In the United Kingdom and other Western countries, you have civic education. You could find some basics of conflictology and peaceful conflict resolution in many school and university curricula. So you should have some knowledge about effective methods of nonviolent life. But many learned people tend to forget all this knowledge, discussing any war in which their country participates. Current wars are easily justified with references to commemoration of world wars or civil wars of the past, with all sorts of myths of good war, which was supposedly just war, necessary war, beneficial war, and even inevitable war. By the way, you can find a summary rebuttal of all of the four myths on the website worldbeyondwar.org. And since our meeting today is entitled Truth and Lies, I should tell you that biggest lie is so-called concept of just war. And the biggest truth is that any war is horrible. And there can be no victors or innocents among belligerents. On the negotiations, all sides win peace. On the battlefield, all sides lose life. When you hear about Russian violent power grabs in Donetsk and Crimea in 2014 and further war crimes and human rights violations in Ukraine from Western media, or when you hear about Western violent power grab in Kiev in 2014 and Ukrainian war crimes and human rights violations from Russian media, after proper fact check, both sorts of regretful information can be partly approved and properly corroborated, despite in many cases you will find also a lot of ideologically motivated exaggerations and manipulations. Talking about the most known facts, I agree with some factual things that David said. I know about emergency motion adopted by Socialist Labour Network. I found it on the website, claiming that Russia's intervention at the moment is basically defensive, it is quote, and all other things. In War Resisters International, we decided a century ago that modern governments allege all their wars to be defensive, but it can't justify the war. Because war is a lie. It is a lie since any war is a crime and there are a lot of non-violent methods of self-defense. To say truth, Russia is not victim of Ukraine or the West, and Ukraine is not victim of Russia or the West, and both Russia and Ukraine are not victims of NATO, because all of them, NATO, Ukraine, Russia, have these military forces, have these armies, and therefore are aggressors, because all peace-loving people in Ukraine and Russia and the West are victims victims of their militarist warmongering governments and this enormous tax pressure to make people work for their own killing. Mutual killing of the people. It is insane. You can ask, what if people make democratic choice in favor of violence and war? I heard this argument before, like it is for Ukrainians to decide whether to be militant in face of Russian aggression. I reject this notion for two reasons. Firstly, an uneducated, misinformed choice under influence of the propaganda of war and military patriotic upbringing is not a choice free enough to respect it. Secondly, I don't believe militarism and democracy are compatible. I don't think that violence of the majority towards minorities, including individuals, in enforcing majority rule is democratic. True democracy is everyday, universal involvement in honest, critical discussion of public issues and universal participation in decision-making. Any democratic decision should be consensual in the sense that it is supported by the majority of stakeholders and deliberate enough to be not harmful for minorities, including individuals, and nature. If the decision makes impossible the acquiescence of those who disagree, harming people, excluding them from the people, it is not a democratic decision. For this reason, I can't accept democratic decision to wage so-called just war and to punish pacifists. It can't be democratic by definition. And if somebody thinks it is democratic, I doubt such sort of democracy has any value or just sense. I will quote now the statement of the Ukrainian pacifist movement against perpetuation of war. Because I heard that Prime Minister Boris Johnson said a long war ahead, a war of attrition up to 2023, or, remember this Orwellian indefinite war, in this famous dystopia 1984. So our statement. Ukrainian pacifist movement is gravely concerned about the active burning of bridges for a peaceful resolution of conflict between Russia and Ukraine on both sides, and signals of intentions to continue the bloodshed indefinitely to achieve some sovereign ambitions. We condemn the Russian decision to invade Ukraine on February 24, 2022, which led to a fatal escalation and thousands of deaths. Reiterating our condemnation of the reciprocal violations of the ceasefire envisaged in Minsk agreements by Russian and Ukrainian combatants in Donbas prior to the escalation of Russian aggression. We condemn the mutual labeling of parties to the conflict as Nazi-alike enemies and war criminals, stuffed into legislation, reinforced by official propaganda of extreme and irreconcilable hostility. We believe that the law should build peace, not incite war, and history should give us examples how people can return to peaceful life, not excuses for continuing the war. We insist that accountability for crimes must be established by an independent and competent judicial body in due process of law, in result of unbiased and impartial investigation, especially in the most serious crimes, such as genocide. We emphasize that the tragic consequences of military brutality must not be used to incite hatred and justify new atrocities. On the contrary, such tragedies should cool the fighting spirit and encourage a persistent search for the most bloodless ways to end the war. We condemn military actions on both sides, the hostilities which harm civilians. We insist that all shooting should be stopped. All sides should honor the memory of killed people and, after due grief, calmly and honestly commit to peace talks. We condemn statements on the Russian side about the intention to achieve certain goals or by military means if they cannot be achieved through negotiations. We condemn statements on the Ukrainian side that continuation of peace talks depends on winning the best negotiating positions at the battlefield. We condemn the unwillingness of both sides to cease fire during the peace talks. We condemn the practice of forcing civilians to conduct military service, to perform military tasks, and to support the army against the will of peaceful people in Russia and Ukraine. We insist that such practices, especially during hostilities, grossly violate the principle of distinction between militaries and civilians in international humanitarian law. Any forms of contempt for the human right to conscientious objection to military service are unacceptable. We condemn all military support provided by Russia and NATO countries for militant radicals in Ukraine, provoking further escalation of the military conflict. We call on all peace-loving people in Ukraine and around the world to remain peace-loving people in all circumstances and to help others to be peace-loving people, to collect and disseminate knowledge about peaceful and nonviolent way of life, to tell the truth that unites peace-loving people, to resist evil and injustice without violence, and debunk myths about necessary, beneficial, inevitable, and just war. We don't call for any particular action now to ensure that peace plans will not be targeted by hatred and attacks of militaries. But we are confident that pacifists of the world have a good imagination and experience of practical realization of their best dreams. Our actions should be guided by hope for peaceful and happy future and not by fears. Let our peace work bring closer the future from dreams. War is a crime against humanity. Therefore, we are determined not to support any kind of war and to strive for the removal of all causes of war. That is our statement, and I will be happy during this discussion to elaborate any things that I said during this presentation. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, Yurii. Reference to Jeremy Corbyn, who quite early on in this process said that all wars ultimately end in negotiation. We should actually carry out that negotiation before we start killing each other. Clearly, we all want to be in that place where we have peace. I do remember a trip I made to Caucasus a few years ago, and read about the complete slaughter of the Cathars by the Crusaders, complete peace-loving people who just made no resistance other than praying. So there is a question as to how we actually get to that point where we do have peace-loving peoples, and I hope that that will be brought out in the discussion later on. We have an opportunity to explore that further, Yurii. So we're now going to move on to our final speaker before we have speakers from the floor, Tony Greenstein. And Tony's actually written a number of blogs about the situation in Ukraine, and he's also had an article published in the Weekly Worker. We will put the links to those articles and items in the chat. But now, without further ado, thank you, Tony, for coming this evening, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Esther. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
I appreciate and understand and respect everything that Yurii has said, but I'm not a pacifist. And I have to say that if pacifism had been adopted, the Americans would still be in Vietnam. There are sometimes just wars, the wars of national liberation, the wars against an imperialist aggressor, the war of, say, the Yugoslavian resistance against the Nazis, and so on. It is unfortunate sometimes you have to resist evil with violence, but that is unfortunately inevitable. But as I say, I respect everything that you say, and I welcome the debate that we're having. Now, I think we have to put this in some kind of context, and it's actually a pivotal moment, in a sense, for the left in this country. The best comparison I can think is with 1914. All the socialist parties in Europe, which had pledged to support the unity of the working class, when it came down to it, they all, without exception, I think Karl Liebknecht was the only exception, voted war credit for their respective bourgeoisies. For many, certainly the British working class and the trade union movement, the cause was plucky little Belgium, and today it is really plucky little Ukraine. And I have to say, whatever this war is about, it's not about Ukraine, and it's not about Ukrainian national self-determination. I think it's quite clear, in fact, whenever Zelensky has moved towards the idea of neutrality and not being part of NATO, Biden and the United States have pulled him back into line. Even worse, we see the reality of what the United States has been doing, because for the last 8 years, the United States, the CIA and all the other militaries have been training the militias of Azov, the right sector, and all the rest of the fascists that we see today in Ukraine. And those fascists, I mean, when Zelensky went to challenge them in the Donbass and said, I want to implement Minsk II, they made it very clear that if he tried to agree to a settlement that included autonomy for the people of eastern Ukraine, he wouldn't be on this earth for very long. That is the reality. When we talk about Nazis in Ukraine, of course, people say that it's really not irrelevant, that of course everybody has a few Nazis in their country and in their armies, and that's absolutely true. But the difference, and it is a very crucial difference, is that in Ukraine, neo-Nazi militias have been integrated into the state itself, into the army itself. They wield enormous power, as we've seen in Mariupol, where they've held a city to ransom for the last 8 years. And despite all the Western propaganda, I have no doubt whatsoever that when Russia gains absolute control of Mariupol, we will see the mass graves of the people that Azov have slaughtered in their efforts to wage the war that they have been doing. So we should be under no doubt what this is about. Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine is a proxy war. It's a proxy war fought by the United States, literally to the last Ukrainian, because the United States doesn't want to see boots on the ground from its own military, but it's happy to fight however many casualties there are, because what the United States is, it is a declining imperial power. We saw that with the scuttle from Afghanistan, and it has got a pivot to Asia, a war against China, at the moment an economic war, and it wants to envelop and to encircle Russia as part of that pivot. And we have to be clear, this is not an imperialist war. This is actually a defensive war fought by Russia. Now, I'm not saying I supported Putin's initial invasion. I didn't. I think he fell into Biden's trap, and that is extremely unfortunate. But given the situation today, a defeat for Russia and a victory for the United States would actually involve us in far greater wars in the future. That is the reality that we are facing today. So when people talk about the prospect of neo-Nazism in Ukraine, this is not an idle threat. And it's quite interesting when you look at the reaction of the Zionists, the people who support the Israeli state. You'll remember under Jeremy Corbyn, they could smell anti-Semitism 10 miles away, the faintest trope, and they were jumping up and down. But when it comes to neo-Nazis in Ukraine today, they simply do not want to know. And I reference this in my blog, and I'm going to quote, it's an interview with a Professor David Shipman by the American Defense, the Anti-Defamation League, which is one of the main Zionist organizations in the United States. He is asked, David Fishman is asked, this is a friendly interview by ADL, and the question is, but we've seen torchlit marches in the middle of Kiev with the red and black, that's the Nazi colours of UPA, that is the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and pictures of Stepan Bandera, who allied with the Nazis during World War II. Isn't that evidence of Nazism in Ukraine? Remember, Bandera and the organisation of Ukrainian nationalists and his insurgent army slaughtered 200,000 Jews, 100,000 Poles, a countless number of Hungarians and other minorities, including Roma. And Fishman, who is on the academic committee of the US Holocaust Museum, said, quote, "For Ukrainian nationalists, UPA, the insurgent army, and Bandera are symbols of the Ukrainian fight for Ukrainian independence. The UPA allied with Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union and marked this for tactical, not ideological reasons. For Jews, however, allying with the Nazis is unforgivable under any circumstances." So he makes a distinction between Jews and Ukrainians. But then he goes on to say, historians have documented that Ukrainian nationalists participated with Germans in the murder of many thousands of Jews in Ukraine. So he goes on to contradict himself, because if the organization of Ukrainian nationalists murdered thousands and thousands of Jews, what was that if not an ideological commitment to Nazism? So the Zionists really don't have a leg to stand on. But nonetheless, because of their relationship with the US establishment, because Zionism and American imperialism march hand in hand, they have to turn a blind eye and to legitimate it and to pretend that it's not a problem when it is a problem, a very great problem. There's no other country in the world which has a national holiday in memory of a Nazi collaborator by the name of Stepan Bandera. Ukraine is the only such country in the world. Not only that, I mean, there are dozens of streets and monuments to Bandera and Petliura, who was an equivalent at the time of the Russian Civil War. But they've even named the street leading up to Babi Yar. Babi Yar was the first great Nazi massacre of Jews and then many other people. It's just outside Kiev. 33,000 were murdered at the end of September in 1941 in 2 days. They have renamed that street Stepan Bandera Avenue or Street or whatever it is. That is the contempt that that is held by the ruling class in Ukraine for the history of anti-fascism and its willingness to turn a blind eye, if not to adopt the neo-Nazi ideology. Now, I put out a blog last night about what happened in Bucha. People remember, you still know the propaganda about the Russians having murdered over 700 Ukrainians before they left this small town on the outskirts of Kiev. And at first, I, like so many other people, were taken in by this. And I thought, this is absolutely horrific. Why the hell would Russia want to slaughter Ukrainians as they left? This is not part of any declared objective. But when I looked at it, the evidence showed quite clearly that there was something amiss. For example, the mayor of Bucha, the very day after the Russians had left, was beaming, speaking on Ukrainian TV and declaring what a victory and how the town was liberated. he did not mention one word about this so-called Russian slaughter. At the same time, the National Police of Ukraine openly said that its Safari Battalion, a special police unit mainly commanded by the Azov Battalion, someone called Botson in particular, a thug and a murderer with a very sordid past and history, were going in to cleanse, inverted commas, cleanse Bucha. That would have, to any normal person, sounded ominous, because what is cleansing in terms of human beings? Well, I'll tell you. For those of you who are not acquainted with the history of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, what cleansing meant was that as the German army invaded the Soviet Union, the killing squads called the Einsatzgruppen, only about 3,000 of them, mopped up in the rear. And who did they mop up? Jews and gypsies and communists. And they slaughtered about 1 million people by shooting them, first forcing them to dig their own graves and then shooting them. They were called cleansing operations. And it's no accident that the same terminology that was used by the Nazis when they dealt with their racial enemies is now being used by the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. But what makes them dangerous is not that they may only get 2% in the elections. What makes them dangerous, they've been integrated into the Ukrainian state itself. That is absolutely unique anywhere in the world. And of course, it doesn't surprise me that people are pulling out all the stops. Anyone who saw Ros Atkins, the BBC presenter, he spent 10 minutes telling us how Azov Battalion had been denazified. They were no longer a threat. They have their own party. Therefore, we need pay them no attention. This is absolutely absurd and total nonsense. And in Bucha, we saw, I mean, there is actually so much evidence. For instance, we were told there were satellite images of the bodies on the 19th of March. That is 2 weeks before the Russians left. Well, anyone knows if bodies are left out in the open for two weeks, you'll be able to smell them a mile off. They will be bloated. They will be distorted. They'll be liquefying even. This is simply not credible. And it's not surprising. And these so-called satellite images have even been disowned by the Pentagon, who say they cannot confirm them. And the reason they can't confirm them is that this evidence does not exist. Now, we have to be clear. David was right when he said Ukrainian self-determination begs the question, who are the Ukrainians? In essence, we've had a civil war. But this civil war marks out, if you like, a very clear differentiation of the left. You have some people like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, the anti-communist resistance, which is actually the anti-capitalist resistance, have taken the position of support for what they call Ukrainian resistance. In other words, they see it only in terms of the Ukrainians. They ignore totally the role of NATO. As socialists, I think we have to be quite clear. The real problem today is the attempt of the United States to expand itself militarily in order to counteract or to offset its economic weakness, a growing economic weakness in the face of China's competition in particular. So I hope today we make clear that our position is an anti-imperialist one. Certainly we support the anti-war protesters in Russia itself. We support democracy in Russia. Absolutely no doubt about that. And we support anti-fascist in Ukraine itself, wherever they live, because they have a fight on against Azov and all the other fascist militias, which Zelensky has taken under his wing. Thank you, comrades. I'm sure we're going to have a great meeting. And I hope I didn't go over 10 minutes.
That was great, comrade. Thank you very much for the work you've been doing in the blogs and articles you're writing as well. Shining a light on all these things is just so very important. So we've heard from our speakers this evening about the false flags and providing evidence of those. We've looked at the reasons for the war, what's driving the war, and the potential escalation. We've heard a clear call for peace. We've seen specific lies being exposed by our comrade Tony. We've asked the question, well, who are the Ukrainians? And of course, we understand the impact and the influence and the importance of capitalism and militarism in driving this conflict and the proxy nature of the conflict. So now we're going to open the meeting to comrades from the floor. If you want to speak, please raise your hand, and we'll give you up to 3 minutes. I do want to say that in the email that we circulated about the meeting, we didn't include the full statement that was approved by the all members meeting about the Ukraine conflict, and we'll circulate that correctly and fully after the meeting. So now we'll move to questions and comments. And first, if we can go please to Richard, and we'll promote you to a panelist, and then we will spotlight you. How are you? Do you want to?
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, there you are. Thank you, Richard.
Hello. How long have I got, Esther? Sorry.
3 minutes.
Right. Well, 3 minutes. I'll make 3 points. First of all, the material in the email that was sent out wasn't incomplete. It was false. It included stuff that isn't policy of the Socialist Labour Network. We oppose both sides in this conflict, and rightly so. Look, all sides in a war will say that they are defending themselves. The question of who started it is, and who fires the first shot is, as many have said here today, absolutely not the point. The real question is what's really going on. Now, Russia is a weak power compared to America, but the same system, it's not the USSR, the same system predominates, the system of finance capital, and Russia is, as a weaker power, just like Germany was weaker than Britain in 1913, is asserting itself regionally and using a lot of the issues that we've raised as a pretext. So, for example, if we look at Donbass, is Russia defending Donbass? No. The people of Donbass have voted for autonomy, not to separate, and the people of Donbass have been surveyed on numerous occasions. There is no majority for separation. There is a clear majority for autonomy within Ukraine, just as Ukraine had, just as Crimea was an autonomous republic in 1991 within Ukraine. Now, what Russia is doing is not only seizing territory and backing a secession which the people of Donbass do not support, but is also hammering and shelling Kharkiv and Mariupol, which are not the actions of a liberating army at all. So it's quite clear to me that Russia is not only theoretically an imperialist power dominated by finance capital, if you want to use that Marxian framework for analysing this, but is acting as such as well. Second, we should not support Ukraine. Why? Ukraine is no minor little colony of Russia, but a territory which is clearly being fought over by both sides, by Russia and the West. Just as the Donbass People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic were never seriously established by the people or elected there, so it's the case that Ukraine, in violating the autonomy of Donbass, is itself engaging in a clear violation of the right of the people of Donbass to self-determination, and clearly has been put up to this by NATO, that are arming them to the teeth and that are engaged in an economic war against Russia in an attempt to impoverish the Russian people, an attempt which incidentally and interestingly appears to have failed as a result of the way in which Russia has been is attempting to prop up the ruble. So no, we shouldn't support them either. Who do we support? Final point here. We don't support either band of oligarchs, irrespective of whether one is richer than the other. We do not support either army. We do not support either bloc. We do not support Ukraine with its irredentist claims on Crimea and Donbass, and nor do we support the Russian Federation, whose leader, a right-wing nationalist, has denounced Lenin and the Bolsheviks' policy of the right of self-determination to Ukraine. Why? Because clearly he's not defending people there. He is attempting to seize territory, because they're all part of the same system. And the fact that one power is weaker than the other, or that one power is being menaced by the other, that's the whole game of arguing over who started it. And we'll end up saying, oh, well, this argument by the Western media is wrong, and that argument by the Russian media is wrong, and get into this nonsensical game of claiming that everything that doesn't support one side or the other, depending on whose side you're on, is a false flag. Let us instead side with the people that we, as the Labour movement, were set up to support. Just as we opposed neither side in the First World War, so we should oppose neither side in this. Who do we support? We support the workers. We support the workers of Ukraine. We support the workers of Russia. Tony Greenstein says that he wants to support the Russian anti-war movement. Well, if you back Russia in this war, then why would you be supporting the Russian anti-war movement? Of course we should support them because the war is unjust. Just as we should support those, whether we agree with everything they say. I'm not a pacifist. I don't agree with what Yurii said in every respect, but of course we will support Yurii insofar as he is attempting to stop the war in Ukraine. Therefore, we must take no side in this conflict, and that is the policy of the Socialist Labour Network. The policy of the Socialist Labour Network, adopted by a majority at its all members meeting, and I'm very pleased that it was. And I think we must defend that policy against the attempt that I do see developing here tonight of some within the network to pull us instead into a rather, unhappy, not really working class policy of backing one side in an inter-imperialist war that will completely remove our ability to speak with integrity and authority to labour movements around the world who want an end to this war and to stop both sides. People say, how are you going to do that? How can you stop the thugs? Do you know how? Do you know how? By supporting the working class and anti-war movement in both countries, not by taking sides with one right-wing regime against another.
Thank you, Richard. You made your point very clearly, bearing in mind that the purpose of this meeting is to expose both truth and lies, and we will make sure that we circulate the motion adopted by the all members meeting after this meeting. Thank you very much. I've promoted James Hall to the panel as well. So James, are you ready to provide your contribution?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we can see you too. Oh no, that's Ian. Hang on, I've got the wrong person. If anyone else can get there first. Can you start your video, James, or would you prefer to remain incognito? There you are.
I'm sure everyone.
3 minutes, James.
I'm sure everyone would like to see my lovely face. Well, I'll start off by saying that I'm a Putin apologist, a Putin troll, a tanky, apparently. Chris certainly said things which appeal to me, which is the appalling extent to which the so-called left has swallowed the propaganda hook, line and sinker. People who quite plainly recognise the black propaganda war against Jeremy Corbyn suddenly seem to have decided that the media can be trusted absolutely. It's beyond my comprehension. We see propaganda from both sides because modern warfare is a great deal to do with propaganda. But I think, we should look for two particular signs which are diagnostic. One is when we hear only about atrocities from one side, and the other is when all economic, diplomatic, political considerations are ignored and the whole thing is reduced to one of personalities. In this case, Putin is the most evil man in the world. These are signs that we are being manipulated. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. As for aggression, well, whether it's imperialist or capitalist or whatever, I pointed this out to someone on social media yesterday. Aggression takes more forms than just invading with an army. I invite people to look at the case of Chile, where the appalling Pinochet regime was launched on the Chilean people, essentially by a coup engineered by the United States. The toll of the disappeared in Chile far outweighs the number apparently killed in Ukraine so far. And you can bet those people met as a horrible death as anyone in the Ukraine conflict. We should consider which is the lesser evil and which is the greater aggression in absolute fact. I would like to finish by saying there is one thing which has not been mentioned whatsoever, and which I find as appalling as anything in the whole thing, and that is the way that the left has failed completely to call out the racism which is inherent in this whole situation. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who is wrapping themselves in the Ukrainian flag, who hasn't previously wrapped themselves in the Palestinian, Yemeni, Afghani flag, and so on, should be looking at themselves and asking themselves seriously why that is. We have a situation where the Ukrainian forces have not allowed non-European refugees to leave the country. We have a situation where Ukrainian forces have prevented aid agencies from giving aid to non-European Ukrainians. Everyone should have said, right, immediately, if you are going to operate in this way, we will not give you aid, we will not arm you, we will not do anything for you until you mend your ways. But no, governments and agencies have just conveniently ignored this. What on earth is going on? Why is the left not facing up to this? Why is the left not calling this out? This is the most extraordinary and widespread manifestation of racism in my entire lifetime, as far as I'm concerned. And what do we see? The BBC yesterday giving us 10 minutes or so of the poor children of Ukraine, what the terrible Putin has done to them, whilst not a single mention of the fact that Israeli warplanes at the time were yet again bombarding Gaza at God knows what cost to the infrastructure, to homes, and to innocent lives. Right, that's my lot.
Thank you, James. You make strong points. Both contributions so far have very much been rehearsing and repeating some of the discussion that we had at our all members meeting, and which helped us to formulate the statement and the motion that we will be circulating. I would encourage contributors to focus on the reason for this particular meeting, which is about exposing both truth, shining light on truth, and exposing lies. If we can try to focus on that aspect of the discussion. After the next contribution from Ian, we will go back to the panelists to see if they have any response to make to the three contributions so far, and then we'll take further contributions. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
My connection's a bit unstable, so hopefully this will go well.
No, we can't hear you very well. You're quite crackly.
Got connection faults, but I'll just try my best anyway. Just on the question of this is supposed to be a war between true imperialisms, but I think that's simply not true. Russia is not a centre of finance capital. Russia is a centre of extractive industry, and it's no more a centre of finance capital in some ways than Saudi Arabia is. Its main industry is oil and gas. It does not actually rule any parts of the world by its financial power. That is simply untrue, and it's.
Ian, perhaps you can turn your volume down because you're really.
I'll move further away. I haven't got a means to turn it down. Russia is as I said, Russia is not a financial power. Russia had no capitalism for 70 years or more, and imperialism is an exclusive club. How can Russia be imperialist? It doesn't actually fit the whole scenario, the whole understanding of what imperialism is. I think that's totally wrong. I welcome very much the speeches by David Muir, by Chris Williamson, and by Tony Greenstein particularly. And I think what they represent is that the war hysteria is beginning to run aground, and people on the left are thinking this through properly. We need to have we cannot have this neutral, this playing on both your houses position when there is an actual attempt being made to destroy Russia and to colonize it, to break it up into chunks. That is the Brzezinski plan. That is what is going on here. That's what they're trying to do. That's what NATO expansion was always all about. Humiliating and destroying Russia. And logically it leads to World War III. And also logically it leads on to China. If they were somehow to succeed in fragmenting Russia, it would lead on to China. You know, and the prospect of war with China, which is even more terrifying. So, you know, I think we really have to take a strong anti-imperialist position. I've not much more I can say, but I would just appeal to comrades to march on May Day in London with anti-imperialists, including ourselves, who are trying to organise a contingent in defence of the Russian people and of the people of the Donbass in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. So I'm going to go back to the three panelists we have left to see you have any responses to make to the three contributions so far. So Yurii, Chris, and Tony. I think David's left us for now. Okay. Do any of you want to respond to any of the three contributions?
I'll briefly respond. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, just briefly to respond to Richard's point. I mean, I disagree actually when he said that Russia is weak. I mean, it depends on how you actually, you know, calculate weakness. I mean, Russia, as I've already said in my opening remarks, you know, is a big producer of and exporter of gas and oil, breadbasket of the world. You know, commodities, raw materials, and so on. So they're in a very, very strong position, actually. And I think, you know, the mistake the West makes really is to kind of undervalue and underestimate the strength of Russia, the strength of its economy. And as for Donbass, I mean, I think things have potentially moved on in Donbass. I'm not sure where he kind of got that information from in relation to Donbass doesn't want its independence. I mean, it's been bombarded for the last 8 years. By West Ukraine, by the Azov battalion, by the neo-Nazis. So, you know, I suspect that, you know, that position, which was the one that was contained in the Minsk agreement, which the Kiev administration, you know, failed to apply, I think things have potentially moved on. I mean, the reality, you know, Ukraine is a US military colony. And just to sort of say, I you know, fundamentally agree with the points that James and Ian made, and certainly in relation to Ian's point about imperialism, I think it is a mistake to suggest that this is a conflict between two imperialist powers. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of what imperialism is, and I think Ian set that out very eloquently.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yurii or Tony, would you like to respond to the points made so far? Yurii, over to you.
May I say, well, when this warmongering is justified by war between democracy and autocracy, or war of good against evil Nazi, or national liberation war. It is just historical references to some wars improperly commemorated as good wars, but they were not. History of humankind contains no just war. And when Tony said that any just war for national, any war for national liberation is just war, well, both Ukrainian nationalists of Maidan movement and Russian nationalists of anti-Maidan movement claimed they waged war of national liberation. Can they be both right in their national liberation sentiment, or consider Israeli independence fighters and Palestinian liberation fighters. Both sides also believe in the war of national liberation. But war never can be just. In our statement, we condemn the mutual labeling of parties of the conflict as Nazi-alike enemies and war criminals stuffed into legislation reinforced by propaganda. Why? We indeed decide so, despite some combatants in Russia-Ukraine conflict on both sides were and are manifestly far-right and even neo-Nazi. On Ukrainian side, Azov regiment, right sector. On Russian side, such neo-Nazi fighters as Varyag battalion or Russian National Unity. But these far-right sentiments were, of course, tolerated by the state, and when we rejected such notion, in Ukraine, pacifists suffer from neo-Nazi attacks. It is true. Leader of Ukrainian pacifist movement, Ruslan Katsaba, was attacked and his eye was injured. He was repressed for anti-war stance, imprisoned and proclaimed prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. He was imprisoned for 500 more than 500 days. But reason for our condemnation of this neo-Nazi narrative on both sides, Ukrainians is Nazi on Russian side, and Russians are Nazi on Ukrainian side. It is because we refuse to agree with implied labeling as existential enemy. We refuse justification of indefinite continuation today and tomorrow of the past wars. And when United States is talking about democracy versus autocracy, it is continuation of their civil war. It is a simple way, a primitive way to portray any war effort, any business on blood, any war profiteering as so-called justified. War should be abolished as social institution. And for that end, reenactments of one-sidedly commemorated mortal fights and delusional victories from centuries-old bloody madness and reiteration of old propaganda of war is not helpful. And because of that, to liberate workers of our planet from the scourge of war, we should develop culture of peace and nonviolence. We should gather and disseminate practical knowledge about effective nonviolent way of life. It is the most important task, and this can help to resolve all conflicts without violence and build a better, more just society.
Thank you, Yurii. I think you're correct to point out that there may well be Nazis on both sides. I think the problem we've got is because we see only the Western propaganda, what we're trying to do is to highlight the false flags and the lies that we see every day. We don't really see the other side because a lot of it is banned in this country. So our approach is bound to be a little one-sided in that respect, but we do want to find the truth about as many things as we can. I'll move now to Tony. Do you want to respond to any of the points made before we move on to further contributions? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, what I said during my speech is, yes, of course, every country has neo-Nazis, Russia included, and until recently, Putin did very little to repress them. They have now, many of the groups, been repressed. But the difference is that in Ukraine, they're integrated into the very security state itself, and they wield enormous political power. Russia does not have a national holiday in memory of a Nazi collaborator who had something like 300,000 deaths on his hands. I mean, it's absolutely a crucial difference, if you like. And as for national liberation movements, well, of course, some movements will claim to be national liberation movements. Zionism does, but of course it isn't. It's a false claim. So we actually have to make a decision. We support the struggles of the oppressed against the oppressor. And if the oppressor claims, as Zionists do, that they're oppressed by anti-Semitism, then we have to call them out each time. And we see that very clearly today when the Zionists have absolutely nothing, the supporters of Israel have absolutely nothing to say about neo-Nazism in Ukraine. Actually, the Jewish leader in Ukraine, Edward Dolinsky, has a very great deal to say about the rise of anti-Semitism in Ukraine, but he's been ignored by the international Zionist organizations because it doesn't suit his narrative. Now, on the question of imperialism and inter-imperialism, I reject the idea that this is an inter-imperialist war. Actually, Barack Obama got it correct when he said Russia is a regional, not a global power. And he was absolutely right. Russia is not a massive force economically. In fact, I think it's the 11th largest economy in the world after South Korea. I mean, there's no comparison between the economic might of the United States and Russia. And I know Chris talked it up, but actually that is the case. I mean, Russia does not export capital. It didn't invade. I mean, why did it invade Ukraine? It didn't invade Ukraine in order to exploit its labor or its mineral resources or whatever. It invaded, if indeed you can call it an invasion, in order to press home the demands that Ukraine be neutral, they not join NATO. That seems to me a very reasonable demand. And to talk about self-determination in those terms, self-determination does not mean the right to threaten your neighbor. And Ukraine joining NATO is a direct threat to Russia. I mean, imagine they have nuclear missiles on their borders a few kilometers from Russia. I mean, what did America do in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962? It threatened to use nuclear weapons if Russia didn't withdraw their missiles from Cuba. That's the difference, and that is the hypocrisy that we're seeing. But I spoke about Bucha. And it's interesting because Russia has demanded an international inquiry. The UN Secretary General, whose name I forget, has also called for an international inquiry. But the United States and Britain have refused. They don't want an inquiry because they know what the results of that inquiry will be, that this was an extremely horrible massacre of people who were perceived to be Russian supporters. You know what the criteria was? They accepted food rations from the Russian army. And by doing so, they were held to be collaborators. I mean, that is outrageous in any terms. But of course, the BBC and all the other clack of media companies, they echo the nonsense put out by Zelensky. I think we have to be slightly wiser and more differentiating. This is a defensive war. It doesn't mean we support Putin. He's run against a capitalist country. He's oppressed his own people. He's played along with the oligarchs. There's all sorts of things wrong with Putin. This war is not about Putin, okay?
Thank you, comrade. So we've got numerous other contributions. We do have a contribution, I think, from Christine. Do you want to speak, Christine?
Sorry.
Or is it Norman?
Yeah, sorry, it was me actually. I'll just.
I thought we had a woman contributing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got I mean, if you want to stop me, but it's just I hadn't renamed the Zoom.
I could say something.
Anyway, I've started my video. But Christine says she'll speak if you like. Yeah, do you want Christine to speak? Or,
I would like, if Christine has
something
to say,
I'll pass it over.
Christine to speak. Yeah.
But I have got something to say as well. But I could be.
All right, if you can do 3 minutes, 3 minutes, Christine, up to 3 minutes.
It won't be 3 minutes. I just wanted to say how thrilled I was to see Yurii speaking for the pacifists in the Ukraine. I am sick to death of hearing belligerent men who aren't in the war zone saying, let's go and fight this, that and the other. And they're not there. they're not being bombed, they're not holding guns themselves, they're not likely to be recruited into any army. You know, let's just think about that. Yuri's there on the ground and he's prepared to take a pacifist stance. I really admire that. And the thing to do about weapons on borders is to surround them with women's peace camps like we did at Green and Common. You know, there are always solutions to aggression, and we should take those as the first solution rather than just thinking we should send more weapons to the Ukraine and keep fighting, keep slaughtering people. So I would listen to the people on the ground, and I really admire anyone who's prepared to stick it out and not fight anyone who's attacking them or take a stand and join armies. So that's what I'd like to say. And I'm here just to represent my demographic, which is old peaceniks from the 60s. And here's Norman.
Thank you, Christine.
I'll be very quick. I mean, I agree with a central point that I think Tony makes, which is that the reason that this war started is that the Ukraine looks like it's joining NATO, and that's a huge threat to Russia, security threat. And Noam Chomsky is very clear on this and draws attention to an agreement that was written in September, between Ukraine-US strategic partnership agreement, where the US agreed to pour loads of money and weapons into the Ukraine and to help them prepare to join NATO. And you know, it's a very, very clear attack on Russia's security. And you know, you've got a mad gangster state sees itself threatened. What's it going to do? Go and try to destroy the country nearest it. But I do agree with Christine that, you know, if you're in the country and you're getting destroyed, it doesn't really matter whether it's an imperialist country that's doing it or an 11th in the country, 11th in the global stakes, you're going to get destroyed. So what I would do is, I think probably, and this in a way again echoes what Tony said, is that it was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the thing which actually in the end led to peace was Russia or Soviet Union then, and America doing a deal, a secret deal. It was kept secret, but they basically did a deal. And this is a proxy war, in my opinion. It's a war between America and Russia. And what would solve it is if America said, we will give you certain guarantees that Ukraine won't join NATO ever. But there'll have to be more to it than that. But that's the deal that'll have to be made. So it's America, but unfortunately, our power, our capacity to put pressure on America is tiny. But that's what needs to happen. Russia needs to have a deal with America to get peace. I hope, you know, that some demonstrations of the importance of peace and saving people's lives, maybe that will put pressure on America. But while we have all this belligerent nonsense on our television and world media, it's not helping it, especially not helping it to say, oh, come on, you plucky Ukraine, let's give them more weapons, let's give them more arms. That's the worst thing that can be going on at this stage. So we've got to put a stop to that somehow. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Norman. Clearly, understanding the reality of the drivers of the war, understanding that truth is central to actually resolving the conflict. I'm going to go to John, then Matthew, then Terry. John, are you going to tell us about a meeting you had with Alex?
Hi, Esther. Good evening, comrades. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I don't plan on spending too long on the platform. I'd just like to point out that there are a couple of issues that are at the root of this conflict. And obviously the first one has been US expansionism or Western expansionism beyond what was the Iron Curtain 30 odd years ago. That has been persistent, and it has gone against previous agreements that have been made with the then President Gorbachev, that the expansionism wouldn't directly lead up to the Russian border. But more of a concern is what's been happening of late. The 2014 coup, which was clearly engineered and backed by Western interests, by NATO, particularly by CIA and British intelligence. And then, of course, what's happened in the last few months with US big arms manufacturers have been flocking to Biden and US and the Pentagon with the promise of more and more money, more and more resources to produce more and more weapons, and pouring, I believe the figure I saw the other day was $3 billion worth of weapons have already gone into Ukraine over the last couple of months. And this isn't turning it into a small conflict, this is turning it into a massive conflict. It's arming Ukraine to a level that competes with most Western superpowers. We also have seen the level of lies and distortion of our media that I've previously don't remember witnessing in a conflict where any dissent in Britain is being closed down. We see it with the silencing of the Stop the War movement. We see it with the silencing of Labour MPs who wanted to sign the motion against the engagement in the war. And we see it in the reporting of events on the ground in Ukraine. As Tony mentioned earlier, and I and one or two other people learned recently at a meeting with Alex Wilson, who made some very useful and informative comments that led us to these conclusions, that the Russian troops have been handing out food and water to residents. Some took it, others declined it. And they already had, as stating, they already had enough to eat. The Russians pulled out to regroup on the 30th of March. The Ukrainians retook the town. The mayor of the town then betrayed the townspeople, and told Ukrainian forces which residents had taken humanitarian aid. Military personnel then broke into people's homes and shot anyone who the mayor had alleged took their aid. And they then and used evidence of Russian ration packs in the homes as sufficient to murder and slaughter the local people, who obviously had been under a curfew position for some time. So we were going to be desperate for food and water. And of course, anybody who got in the way also got shot. And those were the people, those victims, were the people who were then displayed days after Russia had left on the streets of Bucha as the victims of this alleged Russian atrocity. In actual fact, this atrocity had been committed by the Safari regiment of the Ukrainian police. So that's typical of the kind of propaganda that we're hearing here in the West. That is and of course that's not there's no counter to this propaganda. We're not hearing it because it's being completely blacked out of mainstream media, and we're only finding it out from unique sources and through digging through the evidence that becomes available. I'd like to thank all of the panelists that we've had speak so far, who've spoken very eloquently, and I share the views of many of them. And I'm pleased to see that Yurii has spoken up for conscientious objectors, a long history of CEOs in my own family, and we value the role of pacifists. But I also share the position that both Chris and Tony have taken in identifying the major elements within the conflict that have driven it forward so far. And we must resist those. And we must resist US imperialism. And one last point, one of my major concerns is with British involvement in the conflict, because it's British involvement that is being stepped up as compared to any other nation in forwarding the war aims of the Nazi elements and of the Ukrainian state on behalf of Western imperialism. Thank you very much, comrades, and thank you, Esther.
Thank you, John. Yuri's just posted in the chat in response to the discussion about both Russians and Ukrainian warmongers betraying each other as Nazis and fascists. So that's useful. Thank you, Yuri. We do need to move quite quickly now. So I'm going to ask Matthew and Terry to be as quick as possible, because we will need to get back to the panelists for final comments. So over to you, Matthew.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Yeah, no, it's been very interesting. I just want to say that I agree mostly with Richard. I think I obviously don't agree that Russia is an imperialist country, but I think that's a point, you know, which can be further debated. But the important thing is neither side of this conflict is anything to do with the working class. Both sides are deeply reactionary. I mean, one side is basically American imperialism and its assorted lackeys, and the other side, of course, is a bunch of gangster capitalists. Both of them quite happily murder workers, quite, you know, by millions. No issue with it, and we'll happily line up and do it. And that's what we need to say about these things. That, you know, and therefore, I mean, the interest of the working class is entirely against both sides in this war. And I think that this is an important thing about the Socialist Labour Network statement. I think the other thing, of course, is the fact that the ramifications of this war are global. And the fact that actually what they've done, of course, is to cut off one of the world's largest energy producers. The Americans are now trying to redivide the world economy, cut off one of the world's largest energy producers, and cut off two of the world's largest food exporters. And that, of course, what that's doing, of course, is to attack living standards throughout the world for the working class. And we can see here, you know, obviously the price of energy is now ridiculous multiples. We can see that, you know, food is now there's going to be a food crisis around the whole world, starting actually, of course, in Sri Lanka, as we can see the near collapse of Sri Lankan economy. But I mean, that is going to be replicated throughout large chunks of the Middle East and Africa. And the whole thing is you know, the ripples of this go through the whole world in terms of an attack on the working class. And the question is, what is the response? And the thing is, we need to tie all this together, that we say, okay, you know, we are against, you know, the cost of living crisis. We demand that workers be paid in order to do, you know, enough to live, that the prices be restrained, that supplies be provided, and all this sort of stuff. You know, people shouldn't starve. People should have roofs over their heads, etc. And that this is all tied together. You know, we want also the dissolution of all these of NATO, for a start, as a predatory, you know, military alliance. And that we will not, that the worker, it's not in the interest of the working class to provide vast amounts of weapons to keep this war going. And we should be saying, okay, we need to get this stopped. You know, as actions have been taken in some parts like Greece, where they refused to ship tanks and so on across Italy, in which the workers have refused to move military equipment. Can you be winding up now? You know, so I think it's a question of tying some of this stuff together as well into the wider ramifications of this war. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. I only two more people now. I want to call on Terry, if you can be brief, Terry, because you've also put a comment in the Q&A, which I'll ask the panelists to respond to, and also Robert, because Robert's had his hand up for a while. And apologies to anyone else that's got your hand up. We really don't have time this evening. So over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Esther. I'll be quick. I'll try 3 minutes. Yeah. I'm glad everybody
no,
else...
you need to do less than 3 minutes. Sorry, you don't have 3 minutes. Can you try to keep it to one, because you've only got...
I'll tell you what, I'll solve the whole crisis. I'll solve everything, all right? The last 100 years of conflict, I'll cover it in one go, okay? Yurii, it's an absolute pleasure to hear you speaking, young man. People who have been in war zones, I've been in a war zone, a full-on war in the Falklands, on a sectarian one as a child growing up in Northern Ireland. So I know exactly what it's like when people who aren't involved in those things read things and gain knowledge inverted commas, which they apply to a situation which we have first-hand experience of. And as an ex-Falklands veteran, I am now a veteran for peace. So which is an official organisation, Veterans for Peace UK, and I think that people need to learn how to respect each other's opinions. We need to accept the fact that we are not the fountains of all knowledge. How can we be? And that the only way that people are defending their opinions and calling other people's opinions incorrect is by giving a different opinion, which they think is right, and telling people they're wrong because this is what I think. And it was also a pleasure to hear Christine coming up, and you beat me to it, Christine, so thank you for saving me the time, and everybody else the time of listening to me repeating what you said. But we as a collection, as a society, need to understand that the warmongers amongst us are the people living at the higher ends of our society, and we are paying lip service to them by paying into their divide and conquer. And it must be music to their ears when they hear us saying things like necessary evils and just wars and all this. They must love the working class coming out with those comments, because that is exactly the things that manufacturers consent for these wars. And I agree with Yurii that only by us being united as a people against this divide and conquer, against this propaganda, understanding how propaganda works and how to work out how to stand up against it and overcome it, is the way we will stop wars, and therefore no war will be just. Thank you, and thank you for coming, Chris. Good to see you.
Thank you, Terry. Finally, Robert, before we go back to the panel, over to you, Robert. You've already posted a comment in the Q&A. Is that what you wanted to reference, Robert?
Essentially along the lines of my Q&A, it's just to point out how outside of the UK that the propaganda is in full flow. I live in Ireland, and we are subjected to the same propaganda day in and day out. Blonde girls, babies, all the rest of it. And we have an open house here, a totally racist approach to refugees, Ukrainian refugees, compared to other refugees that we've had. And we're way ahead of the UK, for instance, in terms of refugees that we've had. That propaganda is now filtering through to a demand to drop our neutrality and to perhaps consider by our foreign minister, Simon Coveney, to think about moving into joining NATO even. And, you know, the case of Finland and Sweden is also thrown in as, you know, we're going to join this new essential defense of our values. And I just think that the threat to the left has never been so severe, and we must all unite across Europe and everywhere to resist this terrible scourge of propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So we'll go back to our panel now, and panelists now, our speakers now. Given that we only have 7 minutes left, just quick responses mainly focused on the issue about truth and lies, and also the question in the Q&A about the Finnish non-violent struggle, if anyone's got any comment on that. So should we go, Tony, you first? You've got a minute each, so, or 2 minutes each rather.
Yes, thank you. I take up the point that Terry's made, and I say this to him, and also to Matthew and to others. There will be a range of opinions in the Socialist Labour Network. We don't have one, if you like, line handed down from above. But I think one thing we can all agree on, I hope, is that we support the withdrawal of Britain from NATO. We support the abolition of NATO, and that NATO is driving the war effort. On that, we should be able to be agreed. NATO is not a defensive alliance. It's waged wars in Afghanistan, Libya, Serbia, and in reality in Iraq too. NATO is a threat. Now, of course, Matthew, the working class doesn't have agency in this. It's on both sides of the conflict, but sometimes you have to take sides. just as in the First World War, people advocated revolutionary defeatism. And Lenin was quite clear that if a weaker power confronts a stronger power, then of course, regardless of who struck the first blow, you actually have to support the weaker power, the power that is at the mercy of imperialism. And that, unfortunately, is what Russia is. Despite the right-wing nationalist leadership of Russia, it was the same when Ethiopia confronted fascist Italy. Haile Selassie was a total reactionary, but Trotsky supported him. And that is the same in this case. So let us agree, SLN is a broad socialist alliance. We have disagreements, that's really good, but we can agree on the basics. We oppose NATO, and NATO, as Chomsky and others have said, is the cause of this crisis. Okay, thank you, comrades. Great meeting.
Thank you, Tony. We're going to go to Yurii next, but just to repeat, the panelists this evening are speaking on their own behalf. So Tony's speaking on his own behalf and not the Socialist Labour Network.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Over to you, Yurii.
Okay, I am going to agree with Tony. Indeed, NATO should be abolished, and it should be done after the end of Cold War. And since the West failed to abolish NATO, Cold War continued and turned into hot and tragic war with so many deaths, so many destruction. After this illegal Russian invasion to Ukraine, it is disaster, and it is very painful to talk about it. Lies such as NATO is defensive alliance, lies divide people to rule them. And truth, because of its non-contradictory nature, unites people of the world, empowers and non-violently enforces peace. I believe that non-violence is a more effective and progressive tool for global governance, social and environmental justice, that delusions about systemic violence and war as panacea, a miraculous solution for all social problems, these delusions are nonsense. Violence on any side don't deserve support. Peace-loving people oppressed by the military deserve support and admiration when peace-loving people continue to live in peace, to support peace, even during hardships of war. I hope that with the help of all people in the world telling the truth to power, demanding to stop shooting and start talking, aiding those who need it, and investing into the peace culture and education for non-violent citizenship, we could together build a better world without armies and borders, a world where truth and love are great powers, embracing East and West.
Thank you very much, Yurii. Thank you for that message of peace. And finally, over to Chris for your closing comments, Chris.
Well, I can absolutely associate myself with Yuri's comments about peace and love, but I just want to respond to some of the comments, which is sort of, I think, suggesting it's a sort of, you feel like, a plague on both their houses, and, we've got to stand with the working class. And, the realpolitik is that a war has started. I mean, it's a war that should have been avoided. I mean, it could have easily been prevented. Zelensky chose war rather than peace. Let's be clear about that. But we are where we are now. A war has started, and we need to find a way of bringing an end to that. And that isn't going to be brought about by continuing to supply Ukraine with more and more arms. And as for supporting the working class and, and saying, well, it's gangster capitalism in Russia, and that might very well be true, but the Communist Party of the Russian Federation actually is foursquare behind this war, because they also recognize that NATO represents, its expansionism represents an existential threat, frankly, to Russia, for the reasons that I've explained without repeating them in my opening remarks. And John's comment about, Labour MPs being silenced. I mean, it was their choice to be silenced. Frankly, it was a pathetic display of cowardice by those 11 MPs who put their name to that Stop the War statement. It was a fairly modest statement, if we're honest about it anyway. It was an abject failure of leadership. They should be standing up. They should be leading the calls to end the lethal aid, to demand a diplomatic solution. And I'll just finish just in relation to the strength of the Russian economy, because Tony picked me up on that and said I was trying to speak it up. The point I was making is, and yes, of course, the US is a massive economy, and he's talking about exporting capital and financial services and all the rest of it. But you can't heat your house with financial services. You can't drive your car with financial services, and you can't eat financial services. And this is what Russia has in absolute spades. And that's what I meant about the strength in debt for the Russian economy. But look, let's find a way of bringing about the sort of world that Yurii talked about. So far, the peace efforts, regrettably, the past, and Christine talked about Greenham Common. Sadly, I was very much behind Greenham Common and the work that the women of Greenham Common did, but in the end, they failed. Cruise missiles were still stationed at Greenham Common. And we've got to do better than that, and we need to expect more from the so-called Socialist Labour MPs, who frankly have been utterly pathetic and cowards on this issue. And we should be holding their feet to the fire and demanding that they actually stand up for their so-called principles.
Thank you, Chris. It is indeed a tragedy that there's nobody exposing the truth and lies in the Houses of Parliament, in the Labour Party or in the SCG. Thank you very much to all of the speakers and all of you for your contributions, and apologies for those that weren't able to make contributions because we ran out of time. I hope you enjoyed the meeting anyway. I've been